Yasmin smiled at her younger sister, who sat with her feet propped up on the dash of their father's Mazda RX-7. So, are you excited? Suzie looked up at her sister and rolled her eyes. Obviously, I haven't seen Dusty since camp a month ago. I miss him with my whole heart. Yasmin smiled at her sister, who was clearly lovesick as she thought about her boyfriend. Ooh, are you in love? Susie's cheeks flared red as she reached over and smacked her sister's shoulder. Shut up! Yasmin laughed as they pulled into the small town of Hawkins, Indiana. It was pure luck that Yasmin was enrolled in Purdue for the fall semester. She was able to convince their parents she had to register for classes and wanted to see the campus before she moved in, and it would be sisterly bonding. Apparently, Suzie had helped her boyfriend save his friends in the world by knowing some mathematical equation known as Planck's constant, whatever that was. As thanks, he invited her to hang out with him and his friends for 2 weeks, or forever, as her sister claimed he had said. Her sister brought back her attention as she cleared her throat and looked up at her sister with a smug smirk. Yasmin looked at her sister questioningly, quirking an eyebrow. Oh god, what? Dustin said he has a friend named Steve your age, Suzie said, looking at her sister with a teasing look. Yasmin rolled her eyes, pretending not to understand her. And your point is? Suzie scoffed as she dug through her bag and pulled out a brush so she could get ready to see Dustin again as the two got closer to their destination.
My point is that you should try to get to know him and maybe you two could date. Dustin said he's basically the cool older brother for all his friends and he seems nice from what Dusty says. Besides, it's not like you'd have anything to lose. We're here for 2 weeks and if it doesn't work out then you can leave and forget about him. Yasmin hummed in thought as she briefly looked at her younger sister. Yeah, and what if I do end up hitting it off with this Steve? Suzie smirked as she put the brush away and went to clean her glasses. Then you can make out with him all the time and I can come see Dustin more. Yasmin laughed as she reached over and messed up Susie's hair, and the two sisters laughed as they playfully fought one another. Yasmin continued through town till they got to the neighborhood, and she quickly switched out the cassette and put another one in, and she rolled down the windows. Suzie looked at her sister questioningly as she folded the map in her lap. What are you doing? Yasmin smirked as she turned up the volume as they came down the street and she saw a group waiting in the driveway with a sign. Just showing your boyfriend how cool you are. Susie's cheeks heated up as the bass rocked their car as Whitney Houston's I Wanna Dance With Somebody came on. Yasmin! Her older sister only turned the music up louder as she danced in her seat. Clock strikes upon the hour and the sun begins to fade. Sorry, can't hear you, Suzie! Suzie was a blushing mess as her stomach was filled with butterflies at the idea of seeing Dustin and meeting all of his friends. But she knew her sister just wanted to have fun. Suzie smiled at her sister as she sang along. I've done alright up to now. It's the light of day that shows me how. Yasmin beamed at her younger sister as they approached the house. Sing it, Suzie! Both of the girls looked at one another and sang. And when the night falls, loneliness calls. Steve watched as Dustin nervously bounced on his heels as he held a sign in his hand that said, Welcome, Suzie, written messily. All of the kids stood behind Dustin, all teasing him for his nerves, but nonetheless, they were all excited to meet the famed Suzie. Steve rolled his eyes as Lucas and Max sang, Reach the stars, fly a fantasy, dream a dream, and what you see will be.
Steve smacked the back of Lucas's head, and Lucas stopped and flipped him off as Steve walked up behind Dustin and placed his hand on his shoulders comfortingly. Calm down, kid. You're starting to stress me out. Dustin looked back at Steve with an incredulous look. Are you crazy? I haven't seen her in a month and she's probably gonna hate me. Oh god, and her older sister's probably gonna hate me for being such a nerd. Steve shook his shoulders and turned him so they faced one another. Cool it. She's going to love you, man. Don't worry about her sister. If she's awful and evil, I'll turn on the charm so you kids can have a good time. Dustin let out a sigh and shot Steve a smile before they all turned as blaring music sounded from down the street. Steve let go of Dustin and Dustin moved to the end of the driveway and said, Shit, she's here! The kids all smiled as Dustin once again panicked and Steve shook his head as he overheard Lucas say, She's almost here and I still feel like she's fake. Steve furrowed his eyebrows as the blaring music turned out to be Whitney Houston's I Wanna Dance With Somebody as they drove closer to the Hendersons' house. The nice car quickly traveled down the street to the end of the cul-de-sac where Dustin's house was located, and he noticed the two girls in the car both singing at the top of their lungs, and he couldn't help but smile. Yasmin smiled at her younger sister as they approached the house, and they both sang,
Yeah, I wanna dance with somebody. I wanna feel the heat with somebody. Yeah, I wanna dance with somebody. With somebody who loves me.
They pulled in front of the house to see a group of kids and a guy her age standing there with the boy who must have been Dustin, holding a sign saying, Welcome, Suzie! Yasmin turned the music down, quickly parking across the street and shutting off the car. She looked at her younger sister to see her looking extremely nervous. Yasmin grabbed her sister's hand and squeezed it, and Suzie looked up at her as she comfortingly smiled. Hey, he's going to love you. Suzie nodded, smiling and reaching over the console to hug her sister before she pulled away and got out the car. Yasmin opened her own door and swiftly got out and shut her door as Suzie came around next to her. She saw the boy holding the sign turn around and say something to his friends as they began to walk towards the house before he turned around and his face lit up and he dropped the sign. Suzie! Susie's face lit up and she rushed towards him. Dustin! Dustin ran towards her and pulled her into a tight hug as the teenagers giggled. Steve's eyes widened as they landed on the young girl's older sister. Holy shit. She was nothing like the dorky girl with braces and chunky glasses he thought she'd be. She was gorgeous. She wasn't over the top. Her style was classic, but God, was she hot. The two teens pulled apart and began talking about how much they missed each other, and Yasmin couldn't help but smile at how cute they were. Dustin was quick to grab her sister's hand and pull her back towards his friend and hurriedly introduce her to them. Yasmin followed behind them as she watched her sister nervously giggle as she was introduced to his friends. Yasmin came up behind the pair as Dustin excitedly pointed at each of his friends. He pointed to the one in front of him with dark hair and a friendly smile. This is Will. He pointed to the red-headed girl and the dark-haired boy standing next to one another who looked far cooler than her. Max and Lucas? He then pointed to the skinny tall boy who had an arm wrapped around the girl with curious eyes and an excited look on her face. Mike and Elle. Then he finally looked towards the oldest guy standing off to the side of them, and his smile grew wider. This is Steve. He's basically our glorified babysitter. Her eyes moved to settle on the guy her age, and she felt her cheeks heat up instantly. Oh my god. His dark hair was perfect, and God was he attractive. Yasmin couldn't contain her laughter at the annoyed look on the handsome guy's face as he said, I am not your babysitter. All the kids shook their head and rolled their eyes in disagreement. All eyes turned to her as Suzie turned and looked at her sister with a bright smile, and she let go of Dustin's hand and pulled her sister forward. This is my older sister, Yasmin. Yasmin smiled at all the teens and waved her hand. It's nice to meet you all. She then turned her attention to Dustin and held out her hand for him to shake as she grinned at him. You must be Dustin. Suzie never shuts up about you. I'm excited to get to know you since I've only ever heard you singing Never Ending Story at midnight when I was trying to watch a movie. Dustin and Suzie both blushed as all the kids laughed, clearly knowing what she was talking about. But Dustin shook her hand nonetheless. Dustin then guided Suzie into the house, excitedly telling her about all the fun things the gang had planned as the kids followed him inside. Yasmin's eyes met the handsome guy's, and he offered her a charming smile as he held out his hand. Sorry for his lame introduction. I'm Steve. Steve Harrington. She shook his hand and smiled. I personally found it endearing. I mean, how many high school graduates babysit a group of teenagers? Steve blushed and laughed as he ran his hand through his thick hair as she said, I'm Yasmin, by the way. No offense, but I'm honestly still kinda shocked your sister is real, Steve said, and Yasmin nodded with a laugh. I know, I swore she was lying about having a boyfriend until I heard the two of them singing that damn song. It officially ruined my movie night because my sister was freaking out about how she saved the world by knowing a mathematical equation. Steve laughed, as he had grown to hate the song as well. He cleared his throat as he pointed with his thumb towards where the kids had gone. Do you want to join them inside? Yasmin smirked as she noticed a look on Steve's face, like he wanted her to not follow the kids. Why? Do you have another idea of something to do? Steve shrugged, running his hand through his hair. Maybe a trip to the diner in town would be more interesting than Dustin showing off his robot collection? My treat. She smirked, tucking her hair behind her ear as she locked eyes with Steve. Lead the way, Harrington. Steve brightly smiled as he pulled his key from his pocket and quickly unlocked his car as he ran to open her door for her. Dustin and Suzie watched from the living room window as they noticed the bright looks on each of their faces as Steve held the door open for her and she closed it before he hurried to the driver's side. Then, the kids looked at one another with sly looks. They were going to matchmake the shit out of those two. Yasmin laughed as she drove all the kids to the video store and they quickly piled out. She rolled her eyes as she climbed out and shut the door as she could already hear the kids bickering. She walked into the store and quickly noticed that all the kids said, "Hi, Steve." She smiled as she saw Steve distracted as he was crouched behind the counter, but waved his hand to acknowledge the kids' greeting. She walked up to the counter and a girl her age moved to her side and smirked at her. "How can I help you?" Yasmin noticed Steve was still digging around for something and she smiled at the girl. "I was looking for someone. He's about your height, hair the size of Mount Olympus, pretty cute, has terrible taste in music." Before she could finish, Steve rushed to stand up and in the process he banged his head against the wood under the counter. Yasmin smacked a hand over her mouth to stifle her laughter as Steve groaned in pain, but his coworker blatantly laughed at his misfortune. Steve glared at Robin as he carefully moved from under the counter to look up at Yasmin. His cheeks flushed red. Hey, Yasmin, what are you doing here?" Yasmin shot him a teasing look as she pointed at the kids scattered around the store. "Playing babysitter since you abandoned the kids to have an actual job." Steve rolled his eyes at her words and he said dryly, "Ha ha, you're so funny." Yasmin tossed her hair over her shoulder dramatically. "Suzie and Dustin both find me hilarious, I'll have you know." Before either of them could say another word, the young woman butted in. "Wait, Suzie? As in never-ending story, Suzie?" Yasmin looked at Steve questioningly as she laughed. "God, how many people witnessed that?" "Suzie is my younger sister." The girl's eyes widened as she looked at Steve. "Oh, so you're the girl of his dreams Steve has been talking about." Steve slapped his hand over her mouth and his and Yasmin's cheeks both turned red. Yasmin laughed as she saw Steve nervously fixing his hair, pretending to be cool as she smiled at the girl. "I'm gonna go make sure they find a movie for tonight without killing one another. Are you coming tonight, Steve?" Steve hesitantly met her gaze as he nodded, leaning against the counter. Yasmin bit her lip to contain her laughter at his awkwardness. "Cool. It was nice to meet you, The badass girl smirked as she reached out her hand for Yasmin to shake. "Robin." Yasmin shook her hand with a smile. "I'll see you tonight, Steve." She waved her hand with a smile before she walked towards where Suzie and Max were arguing with Dustin and Lucas about what movie they should watch. Robin grinned as Steve watched her walk away like a lovesick puppy. She laughed as she snapped in front of his face. "Hey! Earth to Loverboy!" Steve snapped out of his trance, and he looked up at Robin as she pulled out the whiteboard, uncapped the marker, and put a tally under "You Rule." Steve's eyes widened as he faced her and said, "Wait, a point? Why am I getting a point?" Robin looked up at him incredulously before she smacked his arm. "Did the Russians knock all of your brain cells out of your head? You both clearly have a thing for one another." Steve looked over at Yasmin, who was now standing between the kids with an unamused look as they bickered back and forth. He then looked back at Robin and said, "She does not have a thing for me. I'm me, and she's her. I don't have a chance with her." Robin smacked Steve again, and he let out an "Ow! You're so incomprehensibly stupid. She's only going to be here for another week, so if you don't make a move on her tonight, I will." Steve's eyes widened as he looked back at the girl he really liked, and then to Robin, who was giving him a humored look. "Shit." Yasmin groaned and threw her arms over her head as she sunk into the love seat as Dustin said, "We're not watching that movie." She heard her sister groan as she said, "Come on, Dusty, all of us have seen that movie hundreds of times." "Suzie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is one of the greatest movies of our generation," Dustin argued, throwing his hands in the air. "Are you guys stupid? The Karate Kid is clearly better," Lucas said, and Yasmin groaned as that caused Elle and Max to argue with him that his choice was stupid. At this rate, Yasmin was going to pick the movie herself, or she was going to drive off a cliff. There was a knock at the door, but Yasmin didn't get up to let them in as the kids' fighting didn't cease. She heard the door open, but she didn't move until she heard someone kneel next to her and a familiar laugh. "Hey, Sleeping Beauty." She opened her eyes and moved her eyes as she looked over to see Steve. Steve was smiling down at her as she let out a sigh. Oh, thank God. These kids are going to be the death of me. Steve grinned at her as the kids' arguing didn't cease. Well, I'd certainly hate for that to happen. Yasmin shook her head as she moved to sit up on the couch. Just pick a movie and get them to shut up. Steve grinned as he stood up from her side. Got it, princess? Alright, hey, dipshits! Shut up! Steve shouted, and all of them ceased their arguing. Steve picked up their stacks of VHS and looked through them before holding up one. Suck it up, kids. We're watching Nightmare on Elm Street. All of the kids groaned in disagreement, but Steve quickly shut them all down and told them to shut off the lights and get their snack. They all piled onto the couches, and Yasmin sat up to make room as Steve put the movie in, and the room darkened. Steve sat down on the love seat next to her as the movie began to play. She could already see some of the kids cuddled up next to one another as they complained about horror movies, and Max and Elle called them all babies. Yasmin shook her head as the two oldest sat off to the side of the rest of them as they all huddled into two couches. Yasmin grabbed the blanket that was hanging over the back of the love seat and pulled it over herself and Steve, who looked at her with a smile. Sorry, I get really cold, and horror movies kind of freak me out. Steve grinned as the theme music started to play and he saw her tense. You? Scared? God, that's totally ruining my badass image of you. She smacked Steve's arm as she tucked herself further into the blankets and muttered, I hate you. Steve chuckled as he scooted closer to her and threw his arm over her shoulders. Don't worry, I promise I won't let Freddy Krueger kill you. Yasmin was thankful for the dark since her cheeks flared up, but she went with it as she leaned against him and said, I'm holding you to that, Harrington. Steve felt his heart pound as he looked down at the gorgeous girl laying against his chest and couldn't believe it. Holy shit. As they got further into the movie, as it got more terrifying, Yasmin noticed that all of the kids had fallen asleep on one another and it was pretty late. A thought popped into her head. Did Robin really mean that he had a thing for her? Yasmin really liked Steve, and she had only known him for 5 days, but it had felt like months. His relationship with the kids was adorable, and she really admired him for giving them all the parental role to look up to. He was extremely attractive, awkward, funny, and kind most of all. And God, she really liked him. Yasmin looked up at Steve and gently hit his chest to get his attention, and he looked down at her as she whispered, It's kinda cramped in here. Wanna go outside? Steve nodded, and they carefully stood up and quietly made their way out of the Henderson's house and out the backyard. Steve shut the door quietly behind them as Yasmin leaned against the railing of the porch, looking up at the sky. Steve moved to stand beside her, and they sat in silence until Yasmin finally mustered up the courage to say what was on her mind. Steve? Steve hummed in response, his eyes still on the stars. God, she wanted to back out, but Suzie was right, per usual. If it didn't work out, she could ignore him for the next week and go hide out at her college campus and then go home. She needed to grow a pair and face it. Did Robin mean what she said? Her girl of his dreams comment? Did she mean that? Steve cleared his throat as she turned to look at him, and he stuttered out, I mean, yeah, that's the truth. I really like you. Her cheeks flushed and she smiled as she looked back at the stars. You know, when my sister and I were on our way here, she told me about Dustin's friend Steve and how I should try to hit it off with him. Steve smiled as she took her hand and said, Suzie said if things don't work out, I could just go home and never think about you again. Steve gulped nervously as he moved closer to her and asked, What did she say if things did work out? Yasmin grinned as she tucked her hair behind her ear. Well, she said if they worked out, then we could make out all the time, and she'd have an excuse to come and see Dustin more. Both of them laughed and smiled at one another as Steve asked, So, what's the verdict? Did you and that guy work out? Yasmin grinned, her eyes flicking to his lips as she said, I don't know. I guess he'll have to come closer if he wants to find out. Steve let out a deep breath, then he stepped closer to her and looked down into her eyes. She looked nervous herself, but all of that seemed to fade away as she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled his lips down to hers. Whatever the pair had expected this to feel like, it was so much better. Steve's hands gently wound around her waist to pull her closer as she began to tug on the hair at the back of his neck. Both parted as they gasped for air before breaking out into grins. I'm starting to think my sister might have been right about that makeout suggestion, Yasmin mumbled, and Steve chuckled as he said, Yeah, remind me to thank her. Steve pressed his lips against hers again in a more gentle kiss than their rushed one before. They both snapped away at the sound of a camera flash as they noticed all the kids in the doorway and Max with a Polaroid in her hands. Yasmin blushed as she buried her face in Steve's chest as Steve pointed at the kids. "I better get that, Max, or I'll snap your skateboard in half." Lucas groaned as he said, "God, can't they go get a room or something?" "What does it mean to get a room?" Elle asked as Max left the Polaroid on the table by the door, and all the kids groaned as they walked in the house and closed the door. Steve had a small frown on his face as he asked, "What happens when you leave next week?" "I don't know about you, but I'd like to keep this going for a long time, 'cause I really like you, Yasmin." Yasmin smiled as she said, "Did I mention where I was going to college?" Steve's eyebrows furrowed and he shrugged before Yasmin gripped his collar. "I'm attending Purdue this fall. I'll be an hour away, so we can make out every weekend." Steve smirked as he tugged her closer and kissed her as she mumbled, "And for the record, I really like you too, Steve." Dustin cried as he tightly hugged Suzie, talking all about how he was going to radio her every single night till they were reunited. Yasmin didn't realize how sad she'd feel as she said her goodbyes to all the kids. She felt like a surrogate parent, and they had even started to teasingly call her and Steve their parents. She loved how they accepted her and her dorky sister into their group and made them never want to leave in 2 weeks. She was the most sad to say goodbye to Steve, even though she would see him in the fall if they weren't able to come back sooner. Elle and Max tightly hugged Yasmin as she grinned and said, "I'm gonna miss you guys too. I promise I'll bring all my old makeup and Cosmos the next time we come up here so you guys and Suzie can have your own makeover sesh." The girls grinned as they backed off so they could say goodbye to Suzie. Yasmin finally turned to Steve and smiled sadly as he leaned against his car with a brooding look. "I'll be back as soon as I can." She stepped forward and Steve wrapped his arms around his waist as he pulled her closer. "Doesn't mean I won't miss you." "I know. However will you control these Goonies till I return?" Yasmin teased as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "I think I can hold down the fort till you get back. It may burn down a little bit, but it'll be sustainable." Steve teased before he pulled her in for a heated kiss. She heard the kids groan as she smiled against Steve's lips. "I'm guessing that's our cue to end our PDA reign of terror." Steve nodded as he pressed his forehead to hers and cupped her cheeks. "If you need anything, seriously, don't hesitate to call me, 'cause I'll be on the first flight to Utah if you need me." Yasmin rolled her eyes as she said, "I'll be fine. My biggest problem is going to be how I want to cut my hair when I get back." Steve hummed as he played with her hair. Yasmin cupped his cheek and his eyes met hers. "I'm gonna miss you, you know." Steve nodded and pulled her in for a heated kiss. "Me too." She pulled away from Steve and pulled out her keys as she said, "I guess this is goodbye." Steve pressed his lips against hers and mumbled, "Goodbye, Sleeping Beauty." Yasmin rolled her eyes as she finally backed away and winked. "Goodbye, Loverboy." Steve shook his head with a smile as Yasmin turned and wrapped her arms around Susie's shoulders, and they walked towards the car. Both of them got in, and Yasmin started the car before she quickly put in a cassette tape. Suzie looked at her sister questioningly as she messed with the music. "What are you doing?" Yasmin smirked at her younger sister as she rolled down the windows as the song came close to the part she was looking for. Suzie rolled her eyes as she realized what her sister was trying to recreate. Yasmin put the car into drive as she drove around the circle, and they drove up to Dustin's house and slowly came to a stop. Yasmin smiled brightly as she and Suzie waved their hands in goodbye, and she winked at Steve. "So long, criminal!" Steve rolled his eyes as he placed his hands on Dustin's shoulders. "Farewell, princess!" She grinned as the two sisters looked at one another, understanding it was time to go. Yasmin drove down the street away from the cul-de-sac and turned up the music. Steve felt his heart pang, but he couldn't help but laugh as the music in their car grew louder and Steve recognized it as "Don't You Forget About Me." Yasmin then threw her hand in the air outside of the window as if to recreate the Breakfast Club, and Steve grinned as he watched her fade into the distance. There was no chance he was going to forget about her.